She kissed a stranger on a dare. By morning, she discovered he was the most dangerous man in Chicago, and she'd just been assigned to audit his empire. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who called themselves your friend, if you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible, stay with me. This story is for you. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Madeline's story can travel. The bar was called the Onyx Room, and it existed the way certain expensive things exist in Chicago, without a sign, without an address on any public listing, and without apology. You got in because someone who mattered vouched for you. You stayed because the bourbon was 22 years old and the lighting was designed to make every woman in the room look like she belonged on a movie screen. The leather booths ran along 3 walls. A jazz quartet played in the corner near the back, low and unhurried, the kind of music that didn't demand your attention but slowly took it anyway. The air smelled like cedar and old money and the faint ghost of cigarettes from an era when nobody pretended to care about their lungs. Madeline Hayes did not feel like she belonged on a movie screen. She sat at the edge of the booth with her back pressed against the wall, and her second gin and tonic sweating a ring onto the dark wood table, and she was doing the thing she always did at parties like this, calculating her exit, not rudely, quietly, figuring out how many minutes before she could reasonably say she had an early morning, how many minutes before the Uber wouldn't look like a retreat. 26 years old tonight. Senior financial auditor at Delaney, Marsh & Cole, one of the top 3 accounting firms in the city. She had passed her CPA at 23. She had restructured a hotel chain's entire tax liability at 24 and saved them $4 million in a single fiscal quarter. She was by every measurable standard in her professional world exceptional. In this booth, surrounded by women who wore size 2 dresses and men who laughed too loud at their own observations, she felt approximately the size of a coat rack. "You're doing the math thing," said a voice beside her. Priya Sutton slid into the seat next to her with a fresh champagne flute in each hand and the easy confidence of a woman who had never once in her life questioned whether she deserved to be in a room. Priya was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, maintained, deliberate, slightly exhausting to look at for too long. She had been Madeline's closest friend for 7 years since they'd shared a study room in graduate school. Madeline had helped Priya through 2 broken engagements and a tax audit of her own. Priya had helped Madeline pick out a couch. It was not, in retrospect, an equal exchange. "What math thing?" Madeline said. "The one where you calculate how fast you can leave without hurting anyone's feelings." Priya pressed a champagne flute into her hand. "It's your birthday. You're not leaving." "I'm not leaving." "You were about to." "I was thinking about it." Priya laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that carried. A few heads turned. They always did, for Priya. "Drink that. And stop hiding in the corner. Sadie is asking where you are." Sadie Wren. Madeline processed the name with the small, quiet dread she always felt when it surfaced. Sadie was Priya's other best friend, the one who had appeared in their orbit 3 years ago with a real estate inheritance and a sharp tongue and a talent for making observations that sounded like compliments until you were alone in your car replaying them and realized they weren't. Madeline drank the champagne. The night moved the way these nights moved, in circles, in rounds, in the particular rhythm of a group of people who had enough money to drink without looking at prices. Madeline spoke when spoken to. She laughed at the right moments. She watched the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging exits and expressions, and the small behavioral signals that told you who was performing and who was genuinely at ease. Almost no one in that room was genuinely at ease. That had always been her private comfort, the understanding that most people at parties like this were working just as hard as she was. They were just better at hiding the effort. By 11 o'clock, she was on her 3rd drink, and the room had taken on the warm, slightly imprecise quality that meant she should probably stop. Sadie Wren appeared across the table like a weather event, settling into the booth with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had decided something. "Madeline," Sadie said, in the voice she used when she was about to be generous. "Happy birthday, gorgeous." "Thanks, Sadie. You look amazing." A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. That color is so brave on you. There it was. That was the Sadie Wren special, the compliment that was a knife wrapped in a bow. Madeline smiled and said nothing. Sadie leaned in, elbows on the table, and her eyes moved across the room with the calculating pleasure of someone who had already decided on the outcome and was simply waiting to detonate it. So, since it's your birthday, I have a proposition. I'm not interested. You haven't heard it yet. I know your propositions. Priya was watching with the alert stillness of someone who knew something was coming and had decided not to intervene. That was Priya's other talent. Strategic absence at the precise moment it would have helped. Sadie smiled. There's a man sitting at the far end of the bar. He's been there since before we arrived. He hasn't spoken to anyone. He hasn't looked at anyone. He's the most intimidating person in this room, which in this room is genuinely saying something. She paused. I dare you to walk over there and kiss him. The table went quiet. Madeline felt 3 other people at the booth go very still. Sadie, Priya said, with the tone of someone who was objecting while making no move to stop anything. It's a birthday dare, Sadie said. It's harmless. Unless, and here she tilted her head with the precise angle of someone performing innocence, unless you're worried he won't be interested, in which case, no judgment, totally understand. The words were careful. They always were. There was nothing Sadie had said that Madeline could point to directly and say, that was cruel. But the shape of it was clear enough. The implication sitting beneath the dare like a stone beneath shallow water. You're too much, too big, too much of everything the wrong way, and he will look at you and you will understand that. Madeline put down her champagne. She looked across the bar. The man was sitting on the last stool at the far corner of the bar, one hand around a glass of something dark, and he was still. Not the stillness of someone waiting for something. The stillness of someone who had decided that the room required nothing of him and had made peace with that conclusion. He wore a dark suit without a tie, the collar open one button, and his posture was the kind you couldn't perform. It came from decades of being the most important person in every room you entered until your body simply stopped remembering how to apologize for the space it occupied. He was, she registered with a small, unhelpful jolt of her pulse, extraordinarily attractive. Not in a soft way, in a way that had weight to it. Dark hair, just slightly longer than convention would suggest for a man of what appeared to be his professional stature. A jaw that looked like it had been constructed specifically to make poor decisions more tempting. And something in the set of his expression, not cold exactly, but contained. Like a room where the doors had been closed for a long time and the air inside had developed its own weather. She stood up. Madeline, Priya said. I'm going to get a drink, Madeline said. She walked across the bar. She was aware, with every step, of the specific quality of attention she was generating from the booth behind her. She was also aware, and this was the thing she didn't let herself examine until later, much later, alone in her apartment at 2 a.m, that she was walking because she was angry. Not at Sadie, exactly. At the shape of the dare, at the certainty behind it that the outcome was already decided. The bar's floor was dark wood, and the lighting overhead was amber, and her heels were making exactly the kind of sound she'd spent years trying to eliminate. Too much sound, too much presence, too much. She made herself slow down. She made herself breathe. She reached the end of the bar. She sat down on the stool beside him. He didn't look at her. He picked up his glass and drank with the measured patience of a man who had learned that almost everything was worth waiting out. Madeline put her empty hand on the bar. Her heart was doing something unreasonable in her chest, and she did not let it show on her face. This was the skill she had built slowly, over years. The ability to be absolutely calm on the outside, while something entirely different was happening in her body. It had made her an excellent auditor. Right now, it was the only thing keeping her in the chair. I have to tell you something, she said. He turned and looked at her. Up close, he was worse, or better. She hadn't decided. His eyes were the color of deep water, gray-green and opaque, and they focused on her with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely listening, which was not what she had expected. She had expected dismissal, the quick assessment, the slight recalibration, the polite indifference. Instead, he looked at her like she was a document he intended to read carefully. Go ahead. he said. His voice was low and unhurried, and it sat in the space between them like something solid. My friend dared me to come over here and kiss you, she said. It was a birthday dare, which means the subtext was cruel and the intent was humiliation, and I walked over here anyway because I refused to give people the satisfaction of my retreat. So I'm going to kiss you now, and I'm sorry in advance, and then I'm going home because this has been a long night. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, something more considered than that. It's your birthday, he said, unfortunately. And the dare was designed to embarrass you. Fairly transparently, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He set his glass down on the bar with the careful precision of a man who did nothing without intention. Then he turned toward her fully on the stool, and the shift in his posture changed the geometry of the space between them. Then don't make it quick, he said. Don't give them a quick peck and a retreat. Don't give them the outcome they were hoping for. Make it something worth watching. Madeline stared at him. You have two choices, he continued in the same unhurried tone he might use to discuss Trump market projections. You can do the small, embarrassed version, which confirms everything they wanted to believe. Or you can do the other thing, which costs you nothing and costs them everything. She said, I don't know your name. No, he agreed. You don't. He reached out very slowly, and his hand found her waist, not grabbing, not aggressive, the kind of touch that asked a question and waited for the answer. She felt the warmth of it through the fabric of her dress, and her body made several decisions without consulting her brain. She leaned in. She kissed him. It started as something she was controlling, brief, definitive, a statement rather than a question. Then he moved just slightly, and his hand at her waist shifted, and the kiss changed quality the way a song changes when the key drops. Slower, more deliberate, the kind of thing that required her full attention. The bar went quiet. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather changing. Not all at once, but in the quality of the air around her. The low conversation behind them dropped. The woman 2 stools over stopped mid-sentence. Even the jazz quartet seemed to lose a beat. When she pulled back, she was breathing harder than she would have liked, and his expression had settled into something she couldn't read, but couldn't look away from either. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress. She picked up her bag from the stool. Thank you, she said, because she had been raised to be polite, and old habits have structural integrity even when the rest of you is falling apart. Happy birthday, he said. She walked out of the bar without looking back. She made it to the sidewalk before she let herself breathe. Chicago in September at 11 at night was cold enough to matter, and the air came at her like a correction, sharp, clarifying, unambiguous. She stood on the pavement with her bag against her chest, and her pulse doing something she was going to blame on the gin for several days. She thought, I'm never going back in there. She thought, I need to find a new set of friends. She got in her Uber and she went home, and she told herself very firmly that whatever had just happened in that bar was finished. A single incident. A birthday anomaly. The man was a stranger and would remain one, and the whole thing would be a mildly interesting story she'd tell in the future at parties she also didn't particularly want to attend. She was, as it turned out, wrong on every count. The assignment arrived on her desk at 7:53 the following morning. Madeline was on her second coffee and her first hour of actual work, which for her meant she'd been at her desk since 6:45, because she did not sleep late and she did not ease into mornings. Mornings were time, and time was finite and specific and hers to manage. The coffee was from the place on Michigan Avenue that got her order right every time without being told, and the spreadsheet open on her left monitor was the preliminary review she'd been working through on a retail chain in Minneapolis, and everything was orderly and intentional and hers. The partner who appeared in her doorway at 7:53 was not orderly. Gerald Marsh was 61 and wore his authority like a coat that no longer fit him well. Slightly too large across the shoulders, slightly too tight at the middle. He had run Delaney, Marsh & Cole's Chicago office for 16 years, and he had the manner of a man who had spent those 16 years carefully constructing his own importance. Hayes, he said, new assignment, big one. She looked up. I'm in the middle of the Minneapolis review. Minneapolis gets reassigned. This one takes priority. She watched him. Gerald Marsh did not personally deliver assignments at 7:53 in the morning. His assistant emailed them. His assistant emailed everything. The fact that he was standing in her doorway with his hands in his pockets and his eyes not quite meeting hers told her several things in rapid succession, and none of them were comfortable. "What's the client?" she said. He put the folder on her desk. Thin. Preliminary overview only. She looked at the header on the first page. Blackwood Global Logistics. "Blackwood," she said. "They've requested a full financial audit. External, independent. The board signed off on it last week. They want our best, Hayes. That's you." She picked up the folder. Blackwood Global Logistics was the kind of name that appeared on the financial pages with the regularity of weather. Large enough to be structural, private enough to remain opaque. International freight, warehousing, third-party logistics, offices in 12 cities. Revenue that the business press estimated in the low billions without ever being able to confirm it precisely, because Blackwood Global's financials were not public, and the company's founder and CEO had no particular interest in changing that. The CEO. She turned to the second page of the folder. At the top, in the standard client profile format she had looked at 1,000 times, was the name, Nathaniel Blackwood. Below it was a photograph. Standard corporate headshot, dark suit, direct gaze. The man from the bar. The air in her office did something strange. She was aware of her hands on the folder, and she made a very deliberate choice about her face. No change, no flicker. Nothing that Gerald Marsh, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who needed to know how she was going to react, could interpret. "Timeline," she said. "You start Monday. You'll be working on site at their headquarters. The scope is broad. Full review of the last 4 fiscal years. They've offered full access to documentation." "That's unusual for a private company." "It is," Gerald said, and something in the way he said it landed wrong. Not false, just not complete. She looked up at him. "Congratulations," he said. "This is a significant client." He left her office the way he'd arrived, quickly, with his hands in his pockets, without making extended eye contact. Madeline sat alone at her desk with the folder open to the photograph of Nathaniel Blackwood, and the certainty settling into her chest, cold and precise, that there was something happening here that she didn't yet understand. She closed the folder. She opened her laptop. She began to research everything that was publicly available on Blackwood Global Logistics, and on the man who built it, and what she found in the next 3 hours was detailed and substantial and absolutely did not explain why the board of a fiercely private billion-dollar company had decided to invite an external auditor inside their walls. By the time she stood up to refill her coffee, her instincts, the ones she had spent 10 years learning to trust over her own desire for things to be simpler than they were telling her that this was not a routine audit. The question she could not yet answer was what exactly it was. She was going to find out. And somewhere across the city, in the top floor of a glass tower that overlooked the lake, with the indifference of something that had long since stopped needing to prove itself, Nathaniel Blackwood sat behind a desk the size of a dining table and looked at a name on a document his assistant had placed in front of him 20 minutes ago. Madeline Hayes, Senior Financial Auditor, Delaney, Marsh, and Cole. He picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. When he set it down, the expression on his face was the same one he'd worn at the bar. Contained, unhurried, the face of a man who had just made a decision and saw no reason to announce it. Madeline arrived at Blackwood Global Logistics on Monday morning at 7:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than the scheduled 8 o'clock start, because she had learned long ago that the first thing you do when you walk into unfamiliar territory is arrive before anyone expects you. The headquarters occupied the top 6 floors of a tower on Wacker Drive that had been designed to communicate a single message: permanence. The lobby was all black granite and vertical steel, the kind of architecture that didn't invite you so much as process you. 2 security personnel behind the front desk looked up when she entered. She gave her name. They already had it. A badge was produced, laminated, bearing her photograph. A photograph that had been taken from her firm's website, which meant someone here had been preparing for her before she'd even received the assignment folder. She noted that, filed it in the column she was already building in the back of her mind. The column she hadn't named yet but was filling faster than she would have liked. A woman named Claire met her at the elevator bank. Mid-30s, composed. the kind of compose that came from practice rather than temperament. She walked Madeline to the 14th floor, where a conference room had been prepared. Printer, second monitor, access credentials for the document management system, a carafe of coffee that was still hot. "Mr. Blackwood will meet with you at 9, Claire said. "I don't need to meet with Mr. Blackwood," Madeline said. "I need access to the financial records for fiscal years 20 through 23. The general ledger, accounts payable and receivable, all subsidiary records, and the intercompany transaction logs." Claire's composure didn't crack. It just adjusted slightly, the way a well-maintained machine adjusts when you give it an input it wasn't expecting. "I'll pass that along." "Thank you." Claire left. Madeline set her bag down, took off her coat, hung it on the back of the chair, and sat down in front of the second monitor. She logged into the document system with the credentials they'd provided. The access loaded. She looked at the file structure for 30 seconds. Then she picked up her coffee and started working. She did not think about the bar. She had made a decision about the bar over the weekend, that it was an incident, that the incident was closed, that professional conduct required her to treat Nathaniel Blackwood as a client and nothing else. She was good at decisions like this. She had made them before. They were easier when the subject wasn't in the room. At 9 o'clock, the door to the conference room opened and the subject walked in. He looked exactly the same as he had on Friday night, and also completely different, the way a place looks different in daylight than it does after midnight. Dark suit, no tie, the collar open, the same one button. But here, inside his own building, the contained qualities she'd noticed at the bar had a different texture to it. At the bar, he'd been still by choice. Here he was still because the building itself organized around him, because the air pressure in the room actually changed when he walked through the door, and every cell in Madeline's body registered it before her brain could issue a countermanding instruction. She stood. Professional reflex. "Ms. Hayes," he said. "Mr. Blackwood." He looked at her the way he had at the bar, with the full attention she still wasn't prepared for. His eyes moved to the monitors, to the documents she'd already pulled up, to the legal pad where she'd begun her preliminary notes. He took all of it in without commentary. "You started early," he said. "I always start early." "Do you want anything before we begin? Claire can—" "I'm fine. I'd like to discuss the scope with you directly before I go further into the records." She gestured at the chair across the table. "If you have 20 minutes. He sat. He did it without looking at the chair, without the slight hesitation most people have when they're sitting down in a room where someone else has set the terms. He just sat and crossed one hand over the other on the table and waited. She picked up her legal pad. "Blackwood Global's revenue has been reported publicly in ranges," she said. "The last credible estimate I found put your gross at approximately $2.4 billion over the last fiscal year. Your tax filings, which I've reviewed through available public records, reflect significantly lower figures." "Aggressive tax planning," he said. "Our legal team is thorough." "I'm sure they are." She looked at him. "What I'm looking for in this audit is a clear documentary trail connecting your reported income to your actual income across all subsidiaries. That includes your international holding structures." "Of course. You have entities registered in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and the Isle of Man. Standard for a company of our size. The Isle of Man entity, Blackwood Maritime Holdings, shows intercompany transfers to your Chicago parent of approximately $300 million over the 4-year period I'm reviewing." She set the pad down. "I'll need full documentation on the source of those funds." Something happened in his face. Not alarm, not defensiveness. Something quieter and more difficult to read. The expression of a man who had been asked a question he already knew was coming and had been waiting to see how long it took to arrive. "You'll have everything you need," he said. "I'd like to begin with the fiscal 20 records today. I'll have Claire pull access." He stood. She stood. They were both standing now, and the conference room was not large, and there were approximately 4 feet between them, which was professional and appropriate, and also felt somehow like less than that. "Ms. Hayes," he said. "Mr. Blackwood. I'm glad it's you," he said. "On this audit. I'm glad it's someone who doesn't miss things." She held his gaze for exactly the count of 3. "I don't miss things," she confirmed. He left. She sat back down and looked at her legal pad and made herself breathe slowly and deliberately for about 15 seconds before she picked up her pen. Then she went back to work. Chat. The first week was architecture. She was building the map, entity by entity, account by account, the structural diagram of how Blackwood Global's money moved through its various legal bodies and back to the center. It was the kind of work she loved most, and the private part of herself she rarely discussed. The patience of it, the puzzle of it, the way the picture assembled itself slowly from evidence rather than assumption. By Thursday, she had identified 7 subsidiary entities she hadn't found in the initial public records review. Each one had been properly disclosed in the document management system. Blackwood's team was thorough, she'd give them that. But the existence of the subsidiaries wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was the pattern of their activity. 6 of the 7 showed what the documentation described as consulting fees paid to a network of third-party vendors. The fees were regular. They were substantial. They were paid to entities whose corporate registration she began to research on Thursday evening after most of the floor had emptied out. Alone in the conference room with the Chicago skyline going dark through the window behind her, and what she found, or rather what she couldn't find, was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. The vendor entities existed on paper. They had registration numbers. They had addresses. But the addresses, when she ran them through the commercial database she used for verification, resolved to mail drops. Forwarding services. A commercial real estate address in Panama City that housed approximately 400 other registered businesses in a single building. Shell companies. Not unusual in international logistics, not inherently illegal, but the specific pattern of how these shells connected to each other, the way the fees moved in, sat briefly, and then moved back out again through a different channel, had a structure she recognized from 3 previous audit engagements that had ended in 2 of those cases with federal referrals. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes and looked at the ceiling. Long day. She was on her feet before she'd processed that she'd heard anything. Her heart rate spiked hard, and she spun toward the door, and Nathaniel Blackwood was standing in the doorway of the conference room with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a look on his face that was the closest thing to relaxed she'd seen from him. "I didn't hear you come in," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "Sorry." He didn't sound particularly sorry. He looked at the monitors, at the legal pads now covering most of the table, at the web of connections she'd been charting by hand on the whiteboard she'd requisitioned on Tuesday. "Do you always work past 8? When there's work to do? Is there a lot of work to do?" The question was neutral. The attention behind it was not. "Standard scope for a review of this size," she said. He moved into the room, not toward her, just into the space, the way water moves into an available space without announcing itself. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at it for a long moment, and she watched his face, and she could not tell what he was thinking, and that bothered her more than she could account for. "You drew this by hand," he said. "I think better on paper." "What are you looking at?" "Transaction flows, nothing I can't document." He turned and looked at her directly. "What are you actually looking at, Ms. Hayes?" The room was very quiet. The floor around them was empty, the building's ventilation system making its low, constant sound, the city outside going about its nighttime business 40 floors below. She made a decision in approximately 2 seconds, which was a faster decision than she usually allowed herself. "I'm looking at a consulting fee structure that doesn't correspond to any identifiable consulting services," she said. "I'm looking at vendor entities that don't appear to have employees, offices, or operational histories. And I'm looking at the pattern of how money enters and exits those entities, which is a pattern I've seen before." Silence. "Have you?" he said. "In 2 prior audits, both of which were referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office within 90 days of my preliminary findings." He was very still. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you told me you wanted someone who doesn't miss things. I don't miss things. That means I'm going to follow this wherever it leads, and if what it leads to is what I currently suspect it might lead to, you have a significant problem, and you should have your legal counsel aware of that before Monday morning." He looked at her for a long time. She stood her ground. Her palms were not sweating. She told herself her palms were not sweating. "Go home, Ms. Hayes," he said finally. It's late. I have two more. Go home. Not sharp, not threatening, just definitive. The way you say something when you are accustomed to being the last word. She packed her bag. She put on her coat. She picked up her legal pad and the 2 pages of notes. She wasn't leaving in the building overnight. At the door, she stopped. "Mr. Blackwood," she said without turning, "I'm going to find it, whatever it is." "That's what I do." She walked to the elevator and she pressed the button and she stood there with her heartbeat doing something loud and unreasonable, and she did not look back at the conference room door. She found it on a Tuesday, 17 days into the audit, at 6:22 in the evening, on page 411 of a document production that had arrived that morning in a formatted file that someone on Blackwood's legal team had clearly intended to be impenetrable by sheer volume. The transaction was not hidden. It was buried, which was different. Buried meant it was there if you looked, but the looking required the specific patience and the specific knowledge to know what you were looking for and where. It was a transfer. $47 million moved from Blackwood Maritime Holdings to an entity called Meridian Consulting Group, LLC, in 3 tranches over 6 weeks in the spring of 22. Meridian's registration pointed to a Nevada LLC with no public principals listed. She had run Meridian before and come up empty. This time she ran the registered agent, and the registered agent pointed to a law firm in Las Vegas, and the law firm's client list was publicly available in a 2019 bar filing that had never been updated, and one of the clients listed was a Chicago-based entity called Hargrove Capital Partners. She sat very still. She ran Hargrove Capital Partners. The company was dissolved in 2021, but its last annual filing, before dissolution, listed a single managing member. She looked at the name on the screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she heard voices in the hallway outside the conference room, not the low ambient sound of a building at end of day. Specific voices, close, moving toward her. 2 men, maybe 3, and something in the quality of the sound, the lowness of it, the way it cut off suddenly and then resumed, made her reach over without looking away from the screen and turn off the second monitor. She picked up her phone and photographed the page on her primary screen. The voices stopped outside the conference room door. She minimized the browser window and opened a spreadsheet and put both hands on the keyboard and was typing when the door opened. Nathaniel Blackwood came in first. Behind him were 2 men she had never seen on the Blackwood floor before. Older, one in a suit that was too expensive for logistics middle management, one in a coat he hadn't taken off. They stopped when they saw her. Nathaniel's face did something she had learned over the past 17 days to pay attention to. It went very smooth. Not blank, smooth. The difference was important. Blank was the absence of expression. Smooth was expression under control. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "I didn't realize you were still here." "Just finishing up," she said. The man in the expensive suit looked at her monitors. She had made sure there was nothing on either screen that mattered. "I'll let you gentlemen use the room," she said. She stood up, picked up her bag, tucked her legal pad under her arm, with the photograph she'd taken pressed between the pages, where no one could see it without taking the pad from her hands. "Good night," Nathaniel said. She walked past all 3 of them. The man in the coat didn't move out of her path quickly enough, and she had to turn sideways to get through the door, and for one moment she was close enough to him to see the outline of something under his coat on his left side that was not a phone and was not a wallet. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She got in. She rode down 40 floors and walked through the granite lobby and out onto Wacker Drive, and the cold air hit her like a wall, and she kept walking, 1 block, 2 blocks, until she was certain there was no one behind her. Then she stopped under a streetlight and got out her phone and looked at the photograph she'd taken. The managing member of Hargrove Capital Partners, dissolved 2021, Gerald Marsh, her managing partner. The man who had put the assignment folder on her desk 17 days ago with his hands in his pockets and his eyes not quite meeting hers. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold with the city moving around her. And she understood, with the particular sick clarity of someone watching a structure they had trusted reveal itself as a trap, that she had not been assigned to this audit because she was the best. She had been assigned to this audit because someone needed a name on the reports, And upstairs, in that conference room, those three men were deciding what to do about the fact that the name they had chosen had just found what she wasn't supposed to find. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She stared at it for 2 full rings. She answered. Ms. Hayes. Nathaniel Blackwood's voice, low and precise, with something underneath it she hadn't heard from him before. Don't go home tonight. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone against her ear and the city noise around her, and she said nothing for long enough that his voice came again, lower this time, stripped of the professional distance he usually kept between himself and everything. Ms. Hayes, are you listening to me? I'm listening, she said. Don't go home. Don't go to your office. Find somewhere public, a hotel lobby, a restaurant, somewhere with people and cameras. Stay there. I'll have someone meet you within the hour. Why would I do anything you tell me to do? A pause. Short. Because you just found something you weren't supposed to find, and the 2 men who were in that room with me 20 minutes ago are not men who respond to inconvenience with patience. That's why. She looked up the street. A cab passed. A couple walked by arguing in low voices about something she couldn't hear. The ordinary city doing its ordinary nighttime business, entirely indifferent to the fact that her entire professional life had just cracked open like old concrete under pressure. You knew, she said. You knew what was in those records. Yes. And you let me find it. Another pause. Longer. Go somewhere public. I'll explain everything in person, but not over the phone and not on the street. He ended the call. She stood there for another 10 seconds. Then she started walking north. She chose the lobby bar of the Langford Hotel on Michigan Avenue because it was large and open and had 4 visible cameras and 2 exits she had already located from memory because she had stayed there once at a conference, and she had always, without ever articulating why, noted the exits of rooms she spent time in. It was the kind of habit that had seemed like anxiety when she was younger and felt more like preparation now. She ordered a water. She sat with her back to the wall and her bag in her lap and her phone on the table, and she thought very precisely and deliberately about what she knew. She knew that Gerald Marsh had a financial connection to an entity that sat inside Blackwood Global's transaction network. She knew that connection had been deliberately obscured through a chain of dissolved and offshore entities. She knew that Gerald Marsh had personally assigned her to this audit, not through normal rotation, not through the client preference form that Delaney Marsh used for its major accounts, but by walking into her office at 7:53 in the morning with his hands in his pockets and something wrong in his eyes. She knew what it looked like when someone was managing a situation rather than conducting business. She had been managed. She had been placed on this audit the way you place a piece of furniture, to fill a specific function in a space someone else had designed. Her name on the engagement letter, her signature on the preliminary reports, her professional credentials standing between Gerald Marsh and whatever was going to happen next. The water glass was cold in her hand. She realized she had been gripping it. She put it down. She thought about the man who was on his way here, and she made herself be honest about that, because dishonesty at this moment was a luxury she could not afford. Nathaniel Blackwood had known she would find the transaction trail. He had told her on the first day that he wanted someone who didn't miss things. He had watched her work for 17 days. He had let her get here, which meant one of 2 things. Either he wanted her to find it, wanted the audit to produce a specific result for a specific reason she didn't yet understand, or he had underestimated how fast she would move and was now doing damage control. The man who sat down across from her 22 minutes later did not look like someone doing damage control. He looked like someone who had made a decision and was here to deliver it. He had come alone. No coat. The suit from the office, the sleeves he'd pushed up earlier still pushed up now, which meant he had come directly from the building without stopping. He sat down, and he did not order anything, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that she had not been able to get used to in 17 days of working 40 feet from his office. Start talking, she said. All of it. He looked at the table for 1 moment. 1. Then back at her. Blackwood Global's legitimate operations generate approximately $1.6 billion annually, he said. Freight, warehousing, third-party logistics. Real revenue from real clients. That part of the business is exactly what it appears to be. And the other part? The other part, he said, has been in operation for 11 years. It runs through the subsidiary network you've been mapping. The consulting fees you identified are payments to individuals and organizations who provide services that cannot be listed on an invoice. She held his gaze. What kind of services? The kind that keep certain people in power and certain other people out of prison. He said it flatly. Not with shame and not with pride, with the factual tone of someone describing the weather. Protection arrangements, political facilitation, the management of relationships that the legitimate economy pretends don't exist but cannot function without. You're describing organized crime. I'm describing how Chicago actually works, he said. The organized part is accurate. The crime depends on who's writing the statute. I'm not interested in your philosophy. No, he said. You're interested in your signature on 18 months of preliminary reports for a company that is currently under active RICO investigation by the Northern District of Illinois Federal Task Force. The lobby bar continued its pleasant ambient noise around them. A couple laughed at a nearby table. The bartender set down glasses with a clean click. Madeline did not move. How long has the investigation been active? She said. 8 months. And the audit was Gerald Marsh's idea. He watched her absorb that. Your managing partner approached my organization 14 months ago. He had a cash flow problem, a personal one. He had borrowed significantly against future earnings and made several investments that did not perform. He owed money to people who collect with interest that compounds in ways your accounting software doesn't have a category for. He borrowed from you. From my organization, yes. He has been managing that debt for just over a year. The audit was his proposal. He offered to place his most credible senior auditor on an engagement that would produce clean reports. Reports that would give the federal task force documentation suggesting a full independent review had found no irregularities. She heard the words. She processed them in the orderly, sequential way her mind processed information under pressure. One piece, then the next, building the structure carefully so it didn't collapse before she'd finished building it. Gerald Marsh had sold her. That was the plain version of it, stripped of the professional language and the corporate architecture. He had taken her record, her reputation, the decade of careful work she had done without cutting a single corner, and he had offered it to a criminal organization as a shield. He didn't tell you, Nathaniel said. Obviously, he didn't tell me. He told my people you understood the arrangement. She looked up from the table. He told you I was in on it. He told us you were a pragmatist who understood how business worked. The fury was clean and sudden, and she let it show, which was something she almost never did. I have never in 10 years, not once, I have never touched a number that wasn't true. I have never signed a document I didn't believe in. I have referred 3 clients to federal prosecutors because the evidence required it, and I did not hesitate, and I lost those billing relationships without apology. Her voice was low and controlled, but there was something in it that did not allow for misunderstanding. Gerald Marsh told you I was a pragmatist who understood how business worked because he needed a story that protected him. And he chose me because I was the most credible person in his office, and he knew I wouldn't see it coming. Nathaniel looked at her for a long, still moment. I know, he said. You knew before tonight. I began to suspect within the first week of your engagement, the way you worked, the questions you asked, the things you flagged on day 3 that my own forensic accountants had missed. A pause. Gerald Marsh does not employ people like you and know what he has. He used you because he knew your name would look right on the reports. He never expected you to get to what you got to tonight. But you did. I hoped you would. She stared at him. I need the audit to be real, he said. I need an independent review that is genuinely independent, conducted by someone with a record that cannot be questioned, producing findings that are accurate and documented and defensible in federal court. Not because I want to go to prison slightly less than I otherwise would, because I'm trying to get out. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Get out, she repeated. I inherited this organization, he said. I did not build the criminal architecture. I built the logistics company. The other structure was already in place when I took over from my father at 29, and I have spent 11 years trying to determine whether it was possible to separate one from the other without destroying both and killing everyone who depended on either. He paused. I believe it is now possible, But I need the audit to be what it says it is, and I need the auditor to be someone who found the real picture and can document what it actually looked like before the restructuring. You want me to be the before. I want you to be the truth, he said, which is what you were going to be anyway. I just need you to understand what it's for. She stood up. He did not try to stop her. She walked 6 steps toward the exit, and then she stopped and she stood with her back to him, and the cold logic of her own situation assembled itself in her mind with the pitiless clarity of a balance sheet. Her name was on 18 months of reports for a company under active federal investigation. Her managing partner had told the subject of that investigation that she understood the arrangement. When the RICO case broke, and it would break, the federal task force did not run 8-month investigations and then stop. She would be the auditor of record. She would be the face of the independent review that had allegedly found nothing. She would have her license pulled in the first 30 days and her name attached to the case in every press filing for the next 3 years. She had done nothing wrong. That would save her professionally for approximately none of that. She turned around. "The federal task force," she said. "How close are they?" "My attorney believes they're within 60 days of filing." 60 days, give or take. "And Gerald Marsh will cooperate with them the moment he's contacted. He'll give them everything they ask for, including a version of events in which you were a knowing participant. The lobby bar, the pleasant noise, the bartender with the clean glasses. If I walk away from this engagement," she said, "what happens to my reports?" "They become evidence as filed, incomplete, misleading, with your signature. And if I stay, if you stay, you complete the audit with full access to everything, the real everything, not the curated production my legal team has been feeding you. You document the actual financial structure. You work with my team to rebuild Blackwood Global as a legitimate entity, using the criminal network's existing infrastructure but replacing every illegal function with legal equivalents. You produce a final report that reflects not what the company was, but what it is at the time of filing." He paused. "And when the federal task force comes, and they will come, you stand beside documentation that shows a company in genuine transformation, audited by a professional with an unblemished record at a point before the investigation concluded." "That's not a guarantee of anything." "No," he said, "it's not. You're asking me to stake what's left of my professional life on the possibility that a federal judge will look at a criminal empire in a 60-day restructuring and decide the auditor was acting in good faith. I'm asking you to stake it on the certainty that if you don't, Gerald Marsh will make sure you burn for what he did." She stood in the middle of the Langford Hotel lobby bar, and she breathed, and she thought about 10 years of work. She thought about the hotel chain in Minneapolis she had saved $4 million for. She thought about the 3 referrals she had made to federal prosecutors without hesitation. She thought about the way Gerald Marsh had walked into her office with his hands in his pockets and the particular look of a man who had already made a decision about someone and was simply delivering the result. She thought about Sadie Wren with her tilted head and her performance of generous concern. She thought about every room she had ever walked into and calculated the exits. She walked back to the table and she sat down. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved in his face. Not relief, too controlled for that. Recognition, maybe. The expression of a man who had been right about something difficult and was not particularly happy about it. "Tell me," he said. "I control every financial decision in the restructuring, not input, not consultation, control. My name on the reports means my judgment on the numbers, all the numbers, and you don't override me." "Agreed." Gerald Marsh loses everything. His equity in the firm, his client relationships, his professional license. I don't care how it happens. I don't need to know how it happens. But it happens. A pause that was 1 beat longer than the first. "Agreed. And when this is over, when the federal case is closed and Blackwood Global is legitimate and my reports are part of the public record, I walk away with my license and my reputation intact. You make whatever representations to your legal team and your political contacts are necessary to ensure that." "Ms. Hayes, those are my conditions," she said. "All 3 or none." He looked at her across the table in the amber light of the hotel bar, and she did not look away, and she did not move, and she breathed, slowly and deliberately, through the loudest silence of her life. "All three," he said. She put her hand on the table between them. He looked at it for one moment, just one. And then he put his hand over hers and they shook, and the deal that would either save them both or finish them was made in the lobby of the Langford Hotel on a Tuesday night, while the bartender polished glasses and the city outside continued its indifference. She went home. She packed a bag because he had told her not to go home, and she had made her own calculation about that. And her calculation was that she was not going to spend the next 60 days being afraid of her own apartment. She packed for 3 days, methodically, the way she did everything, what she needed and nothing extra. She was closing her bag when her phone buzzed. Not Nathaniel this time. Gerald Marsh. She stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. She answered. Madeline. His voice had the forced warmth he used when he needed something. She had heard it for 8 years and had always found it slightly unconvincing and had never understood why until this moment. "I heard you left the Blackwood building early tonight. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Gerald." Good, good. Listen, I wanted to check in on the audit progress. The client has been asking." "Gerald," she said. "Yes?" "I found the Hargrove connection." Dead silence. 4 seconds of it. The most honest 4 seconds she had ever heard from him. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Hargrove Capital Partners, dissolved 2021, managing member on record." "That's you, Gerald." And Hargrove's registered agent connects directly to Meridian Consulting, which connects directly to a $47 million transfer out of Blackwood Maritime Holdings in the spring of 22. She kept her voice level, factual, the voice she used for findings presentations. "I know what you did. I know what you told them about me, and I want you to know that I know." Another silence. Longer. When he spoke again, the warmth was completely gone, and what was left was something she had not heard from him before. Something careful and cold and slightly afraid. "Madeline, you should think very carefully about what you're doing." "I have thought carefully," she said. "That's actually what I do." She ended the call. She picked up her bag. She had 60 days to dismantle a criminal empire from the inside out, protect her own name with the only tools she had ever trusted: evidence, documentation, and the unbroken chain of a financial truth, and do it while the federal government closed in from one side and Gerald Marsh worked the other angle with the desperate creativity of a man with everything to lose. She turned off the light in her apartment, and she walked out, and she closed the door behind her, and she did not look back, because looking back had never once in her life produced useful information, and she was going to need every piece of useful information she could find. The elevator opened, and she stepped in, and the doors closed, and in the mirror panel across from her she looked at her own face, composed and set and utterly determined, and she thought, Gerald Marsh chose the wrong name. Then the elevator descended, and she went to war. The next 53 days were the hardest work of her life. Not hard the way graduate school had been hard, which was the sustained difficulty of absorbing information under time pressure. Not hard the way her early years at Delaney Marsh had been hard, which was the difficulty of proving yourself in a room that had already decided what it thought of you. This was hard the way certain physical things are hard, the way running feels at the point where your legs are gone, and you are operating on something beneath willpower, something older and less articulate. She moved into a hotel on the first night and stayed there for 4 days and then moved again. Not because anyone had told her to, but because her instincts, which she was listening to more carefully now than she ever had, told her that staying in one place was the kind of predictability she could not afford. She worked from Blackwood Global's headquarters during the day and from whatever temporary space she was occupying at night, and she slept between 4 and 5 hours depending on what the work required, and she ate when she remembered to, and she did not call Priya, and she did not call anyone from the life she had been living 6 weeks ago, because that life was a construction she was currently dismantling. The real access came on day 3. Nathaniel walked her personally to a floor she had not been given credentials for, the 15th, which was not listed in the building directory, and which required a separate keycard that Claire produced from somewhere, and handed over without explanation. The floor was smaller than the others. 3 offices and a server room and a conference space that had clearly been used recently, the whiteboard still carrying the residue of erased diagrams. the markers arranged too precisely to have been left that way by people doing ordinary work. "Everything is here," he said. "The complete financial architecture. Every entity, every account, every transaction going back to my father's tenure." She looked at the room. She looked at the servers. "If I'm in here," she said, "your people can see everything I'm looking at." "Yes. I want that access removed. My sessions on these systems are private. That's non-negotiable." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him running the calculation, the trust calculation, which was the thing they were both doing constantly now. Every conversation and negotiation about how far each of them was willing to go before the ground ran out. "Done," he said. She went to work on the 15th floor, and she did not surface from it for 3 days. What she found in those 3 days rearranged her understanding of financial architecture in ways she had not expected and would not forget. Blackwood Global's criminal network was not, as she had initially assumed, a crude money laundering operation layered over a legitimate business. It was something more sophisticated and more disturbing, a parallel financial system that had been built with the same care and intelligence as the legitimate one, designed not to conceal itself permanently, but to be deniable at any given moment, capable of pivoting its documentation to match whatever version of events was currently required. Whoever had built this had been exceptional at their work. She recognized the craftsmanship the way you recognize excellent technique in any field, with a specific, complicated feeling of admiring something you wish did not exist. She began to dismantle it. The restructuring required her to think in reverse, not building financial legitimacy from the ground up, but converting existing criminal infrastructure into legal equivalents without breaking the operational continuity that kept the legitimate business running. Shell companies became actual holding entities with real governance structures. Consulting fee arrangements were terminated and replaced with documented service contracts tied to verifiable deliverables. The offshore accounts in the Isle of Man and Luxembourg were either closed or brought into compliance with FBAR reporting requirements, with the documentation filed retroactively where the statute of limitations allowed. She worked with Nathaniel's legal team for exactly the amount of time required to understand what they could provide, and then she worked around them. Because 3 of the 4 attorneys on the team had been serving the criminal organization as long as they had been serving the legitimate business, and she did not trust their instincts about what needed to change versus what they preferred to preserve. She told Nathaniel this on day 11. They were in his office at 9 in the evening, which was where they ended up most nights. Him at his desk, her in the chair across from it, the city going dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that made Chicago look like something you could hold in your hands. She had brought a stack of documents, and she put them on the desk, and she told him which 3 attorneys were a liability and why, with specific documentary evidence for each, and she watched his face do the smooth thing it did when he was processing something difficult. And when she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Vance has been with me for 9 years, he said. "Vance filed the legal opinion that justified the Meridian structure," she said. "If the task force gets Vance on the stand, he will give them the intellectual framework for every transaction I'm trying to recharacterize. He has to go." A pause. "He goes." "Today," she said. Another pause. Shorter. "Today." He picked up his phone. She gathered her documents and she left his office, and she stood in the hallway outside for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. Not because she was tired, though she was tired, deeply and specifically tired in a way that had settled into her bones, but because she needed 10 seconds of nothing before she went back to the 15th floor and the next problem that was waiting for her there. Nathaniel came out of his office 4 minutes later and found her there. He stopped. She opened her eyes. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." "When?" "Later." He looked at her. Not the professional attention she had become accustomed to, not the evaluation of someone assessing a resource. Something else. Something that had been developing so gradually over the past 2 weeks that she had been able to ignore it most of the time by keeping her attention on the work, which was where it needed to be, which was the only place she could afford for it to be right now. "Madeline," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. In 6 weeks of proximity, of late nights and confrontational conversations, and a deal made over a hotel bar table, he had called her Ms. Hayes, with a consistency that had been, she realized now, a form of respect. A professional boundary maintained as deliberately as everything else he did. She looked at him. "Don't," she said quietly. A pause. "I wasn't going to say anything." "I know what you weren't going to say." He nodded once. He went back into his office. She went back to the 15th floor. She did not sleep until 2 in the morning, and when she did, she dreamed about balance sheets, which was not unusual, and which she took as a sign that her brain was still doing what it was supposed to be doing, even when the rest of her had temporarily checked out. Gerald Marsh made his move on day 31. She found out about it the way she found out about most things. Not from the source, but from the documentary trail the source left behind. She was reviewing Delaney Marsh's engagement files for the Blackwood audit, which she had subpoenaed copies of through Nathaniel's legal team as part of constructing her defense documentation, and on page 7 of the internal engagement memo dated 3 weeks before she had received the assignment, she found a paragraph she had to read twice before her brain would process it. The paragraph described the audit's strategic purpose, it described the expected deliverables, and it described, in the careful language of a man who had been practicing euphemism for 30 years, the role of the senior auditor assigned to the engagement as someone who would provide independent professional cover for what the memo called the company's transition period. Her name was there, not suggested, listed, with her CPA number. He had put her name in the engagement memo before he had told her she was assigned. She sat with that for approximately 30 seconds. Then she photographed every page of the memo and forwarded it to the secure email account she had set up for this purpose, and she went and found Nathaniel, which meant going to the 14th floor where he was in a meeting she had to walk into without knocking, in front of 4 people she didn't recognize, because this was not something that could wait for the meeting to end. He looked up when she came in. The 4 people looked at her. She put the photograph of page 7 on the table in front of him, and she said, "He filed this 3 weeks before I was told about the assignment." He looked at it. He looked at it for 5 seconds, and his face did the smooth thing, and then he looked up at the 4 people in the room and said, "We'll continue this later," in the tone of a man for whom there is no conversation in the room other than the current one. The 4 people left. She sat down across from him, and she told him what the paragraph said. He already knew. She could see it in the way he listened, not with the attention of someone absorbing new information, but with the attention of someone confirming what they had suspected. "He filed it before you were assigned," she said, "which means the assignment was never a decision that happened in your office on a Monday morning. It was arranged between him and someone in your organization." "My CFO at the time," he said, "who is no longer with the company." "Since when?" "Since 2 days after your engagement began." She looked at him. "You knew from day one." "I knew the audit had been arranged. I didn't know by whom until the 2nd week." "And you didn't tell me." "I was determining whether you were part of it." The room was quiet. She breathed through the anger carefully because anger at this stage was a luxury she had already calculated she couldn't afford. "What is Marsh doing right now?" she said. "Preparing a voluntary disclosure to the federal task force. My attorney has a contact in the Northern District. Marsh met with a task force attorney 4 days ago. He's offering cooperation in exchange for immunity consideration." "What is he telling them about me?" A pause. "That you identified the irregular transactions early in the engagement and approached him privately to discuss structuring the final report to characterize them as immaterial." The words landed with the specific weight of something designed to cause maximum damage from maximum distance. "He's saying I tried to bury it," she said. "He's saying you proposed burying it and he declined to participate." She stood up. She walked to the window. Chicago was gray today. A low, flat sky the color of old steel, the lake invisible beyond the haze. "He's going to give them that story, and then I'm the one with my name on 18 months of reports and a narrative that says I knew," she said. "Yes. And I have no way to rebut it except my own testimony, which is the testimony of someone with an obvious interest in the outcome. Unless you have documentation." She turned. "The engagement memo," he said. "It predates your assignment. It lists your name before you were told. That's evidence of a setup, not participation." "That's evidence of his intent," she said. It doesn't prove I didn't subsequently agree. What would prove that? She looked at him. The question was quiet and serious, and she understood that he was not asking her something he didn't already know the answer to. He was asking her to say it out loud, to confirm that she had reached the same point he had already reached. The only thing that proves my good faith, she said, is the complete audit. Every finding documented, every irregular transaction identified and sourced, an unambiguous picture of what this company's financial structure was, signed by me, produced before the federal indictment, showing that I found every single thing that exists to find and reported it accurately. That's what I've been giving you access to build. That audit also documents your crimes. Yes, he said. It does. If I file that audit, you go to prison. The restructured entity doesn't go to prison, he said. The historical enterprise has a documented record that a court can use to assess culpability. My attorneys believe the restructuring, combined with voluntary cooperation and the audit findings, produces a negotiated resolution. Not immunity, not clean, but a resolution. You're gambling on prosecutorial discretion. I'm gambling on a complete and honest audit produced by the most credible financial auditor in this city, he said, which is a better bet than most of the ones I've made. She looked at him for a long moment. I need 29 more days, she said. That's what the work requires. You have them. She went back to the 15th floor. The gala was Nathaniel's idea, and when he told her about it, she looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for information that didn't compute. The Harrington Foundation Gala, he said. Annual event. 300 of Chicago's wealthiest individuals. Every major political figure in the city. 3 television cameras, 2 newspaper photographers, and a federal task force attorney who attends every year because his wife sits on the Harrington board. You want to do this publicly, she said. I want to file the audit findings on the morning of the gala and attend that evening with you present. I want the task force to know the audit is real and filed and complete before they file their indictment. I want the first time they see your face to be in a room full of cameras where you are standing with your findings in the public record and their case is already restructured around evidence that no longer exists in the form they believed it did. She thought about it. That's an aggressive play, she said. Yes. If the audit isn't complete before that morning, then we don't go. She looked at the calendar on her phone. 23 days. I'll be ready in 20, she said. She was ready in 19 p. The night of the gala, she put on a dress she had bought herself 2 days before, deep green, structured at the shoulders, the kind of dress that was not asking for your attention, but received it anyway. She did her own hair. She did not ask anyone's opinion. She stood in the hotel mirror and looked at herself the way she had been learning, slowly and with difficulty, to look at herself. Not for the catalog of inadequacies she had been maintaining since she was 14, but for what was actually there. What was actually there was a woman who had rebuilt a criminal empire's financial structure from the inside in 53 days, while simultaneously constructing the documentary defense of her own professional life. What was there was someone who had not broken once, not bent her findings to accommodate anyone's preference, not filed a single number she didn't believe was accurate and complete. She picked up her bag. Nathaniel met her in the lobby. He looked at her the way he had been not looking at her for 7 weeks. The not looking that was its own kind of attention. And then he looked at her directly, and something in his face was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, and he said nothing. She said, Don't. He said, I know. They went to the gala. The Harrington Foundation event occupied the grand ballroom of the Meridian Club. Not the Meridian of the shell company, just the coincidence of names that the city sometimes produced. And it was everything such events always were. Money performing its own existence, generosity as social currency, the particular choreography of people who had arranged their faces to reflect the occasion they were at. Madeline moved through it the way she moved through every room, mapping it, reading it, noting who was watching and who was pretending not to watch. Several people she recognized, 3 she had audited, one she had referred. He looked at her from across the room with the expression of a man who had made peace with his outcomes, and she looked back with the expression of a woman who had done her job. She was 40 minutes into the event when she saw him. Special Agent Daniel Corr of the Northern District of Illinois Federal Task Force was not a difficult man to identify, even out of his professional context and in black tie. He had the stillness of a law enforcement agent who had learned to read rooms professionally, the particular quality of attention that was different from the civilian version, more systematic, less social. He was looking at her. She saw him start toward her, and she felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten, and she made a choice in the half-second before he reached her. She did not move toward Nathaniel, who was 12 feet away in conversation with 2 city council members. She did not move away. She stood where she was, and she let Corr come to her, and she waited. "Ms. Hayes," he said. "Daniel Corr, Northern District Federal Task Force. I was hoping I'd have an opportunity to speak with you this evening." "Agent Corr," she said, "I've been expecting to hear from your office." Something in his expression registered that. "Have you?" "I filed a complete independent audit of Blackwood Global Logistics with the Illinois Secretary of State's office this morning," she said. "A copy was transmitted to the Northern District U.S. Attorney's Office at 9:47 a.m. I imagine someone on your team has begun reviewing it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm aware of the filing." "Then you're aware that it documents the complete financial architecture of Blackwood Global's operations across the last 4 fiscal years, including the historical irregular transaction structures, the shell company network, and the restructuring that has been completed over the past 53 days. She kept her voice at the register she used for presentations, clear, unhurried, grounded in evidence. "You're also aware that the filing predates any indictment and was produced by an auditor whose engagement records demonstrate she was placed on this assignment without prior knowledge of its intended use, as documented in the engagement memo filed by her managing partner 3 weeks before she was assigned." Corr studied her. "Gerald Marsh has provided a different account of your role." "I know what Gerald Marsh told you," she said. "I know because his account is documented in the same engagement records I transmitted to your office this morning. He filed my name in the engagement memo before I was assigned. The chronology is not arguable. The documents date themselves." She paused. "I also have a recording of the phone call he made to me on the evening I confronted him with the Hargrove connection, in which he tells me I should think very carefully about what I'm doing. That's not the language of a managing partner declining a junior auditor's unethical proposal. That's the language of a man trying to manage someone who has found something he didn't want found." The room continued its motion around them. The orchestra in the corner moved from one piece to another. A waiter with champagne passed between them, and neither of them acknowledged it. "That's a thorough presentation," Corr said. "I'm an auditor," she said. "Thorough documentation is what I do." He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating attention of a man whose profession was the assessment of credibility. She held it. She had been holding difficult attention for 53 days without blinking, and she was not going to blink now in a ballroom in front of 3 television cameras, with every piece of work she had ever done filed and documented and time-stamped and waiting for exactly this. "Ms. Hayes." Corr's voice had shifted. Not softer, but different. The shift from an interview to something more like an acknowledgement. "The audit you filed this morning is—" He paused, and she could see him making a professional calculation about how much to say. "More comprehensive than anything our forensic team has produced in 8 months. "I had better access," she said. Something crossed his face that was almost, in another context, humor. "Apparently." And then Nathaniel was beside her. She had not heard him approach. He simply appeared at her left side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked at Corr with the specific quality of attention that was not threatening and was not deferential and was not anything except present. Completely and unmistakably present. "Agent Corr," he said. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe you've met my CFO." Corr looked at Madeline, then back at Nathaniel, then at the room around them, the cameras, the witnesses, the 300 people who were now aware, in the way that rooms become aware of things, that something significant was happening in their corner. "Your CFO," Corr said. "As of this morning," Nathaniel said, "concurrent with the audit filing." She had known this was coming. They had discussed it 2 days ago in his office at midnight when the audit was in its final review, and she had asked him what the plan was for the day after filing. He had told her. She had argued about it for 40 minutes, and then she had looked at the logic of it and acknowledged, privately and with considerable difficulty, that the logic was sound. The CFO of record at the time of the audit filing was a position that carried legal weight in how the findings were attributed and how the auditor's independence was characterized. If she was CFO at filing, she was no longer the external auditor making independent findings. She was the internal officer taking responsibility for the company's financial integrity going forward. It changed the legal architecture of her exposure in ways his attorney had laid out in a 20-page memo she had read 3 times. It also meant she was no longer on the outside. Core looked at her. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "I'm going to need a formal interview." "My attorney will contact your office Monday morning," she said. "I'll make myself available at your convenience." Core looked at them both for a moment, the two of them standing together in the light of the Meridian Club ballroom with the city's most powerful people watching from all sides. And he made the face of a man whose case had just changed shape in ways he was still calculating. "Monday," he said. Then he nodded, once, and turned, and moved back through the crowd toward the exit. She exhaled, one slow, controlled breath, the first one in approximately 45 minutes. Nathaniel did not say anything. He did not put his hand on her arm or make any gesture that would give the room a narrative to attach to. He simply stood beside her as he had just publicly declared he would stand, and the statement of it was in the posture and the position and the absolute absence of retreat. Around them, the gala continued. The orchestra played. The champagne moved on its trays. 300 people who had watched a federal agent approach Madeline Hayes and walk away without handcuffs were already reassessing what they thought they knew about the woman standing beside Nathaniel Blackwood. She looked at the room. She thought about Gerald Marsh, who was at home tonight, or in his attorney's office tonight, building a story that no longer fit the evidence. She thought about the audit sitting in the Northern District's document system, 114 pages of the most precise financial work she had ever produced, time-stamped and filed and beyond anyone's ability to alter. She thought about Monday morning, and across the ballroom, moving through the crowd toward the exit with his phone already at his ear, Daniel Core was making a call to someone in the Northern District who needed to know that the Blackwood case had just changed in ways none of them had anticipated, and that the woman at the center of it was not who Gerald Marsh had told them she was, and that the next 72 hours were going to require a fundamental reassessment of everything the task force believed it was about to do. The orchestra reached the end of its piece, and the room filled with applause, and Madeline Hayes stood in the light of the Meridian Club, with her work filed and her name on record, and the final battle not yet won. The Monday morning interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock at the Dirksen Federal Building on South Dearborn, 23rd floor, in a conference room that had no windows and smelled like recycled air and the particular institutional patience of a government office that had been waiting out difficult people for decades. Madeline arrived at 8:40 with her attorney, a woman named Frances Okafor, who had spent 22 years doing white-collar criminal defense and who had the manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and had stopped being surprised by any of them approximately 15 years ago. Frances had reviewed the full audit, the engagement memo, the Hargrove documentation, and the recording of Gerald Marsh's phone call over the course of a weekend that she billed at a rate Madeline did not think about directly, because thinking about it directly produced a specific kind of nausea she couldn't afford right now. "Let me talk when I signal," Frances said in the elevator. "I know how to conduct myself in an interview," Madeline said. "You know how to conduct yourself in an audit," Frances said. "This is different. They are going to try to find the place where your story has a seam. Your job is to not have a seam." "My story doesn't have a seam." "Then this will be brief." It was not brief. Special Agent Core had 2 colleagues with him, one who introduced herself as a forensic accountant on the task force, which produced in Madeline the involuntary experience of being assessed by a mirror, and one who said nothing for the first 40 minutes and seemed to be there specifically to watch her face. There was a recording device on the table. There was a thick folder in front of Core that she recognized as printed sections of her audit filing. Core started at the beginning. Not the beginning of the audit, The beginning of the assignment. He wanted to know every detail of the morning Gerald Marsh had come to her office. She told him. She told him the time, 7:53, which she knew because she had been working for over an hour and her second coffee was still hot, which meant less than 10 minutes had passed since she'd made it. She told him about his hands in his pockets and his eyes not quite meeting hers. She told him what he had said and what she had said and the specific quality of wrongness she had felt but could not yet name. Cor listened. He made notes. He asked her to repeat 3 things, not because he hadn't heard them, but because he was checking for variants, which she understood and which produced no variance because she was describing what had actually happened. Then he asked about Nathaniel. She answered those questions the same way. Direct, specific, chronological. The bar, which she described without omission, the first morning at Blackwood Global. The 17 days of the initial audit phase. The conversation in the hotel lobby. The conditions she had named and the agreement that had followed. The forensic accountant asked about the restructuring. These questions had a different quality, technical, precise, the language of someone who genuinely understood what she had done and was evaluating the methodology rather than the narrative. Madeline answered them with the same precision she had used to do the work, and somewhere in the 3rd hour of the interview, she saw the forensic accountant make a note in the margin of her copy of the audit and underline it twice, and Madeline did not let herself read it, but she saw the gesture and she filed it. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Cor set down his pen. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "Gerald Marsh filed a voluntary disclosure with this office 11 days ago. He identified you as a knowing participant in an arrangement to produce misleading audit findings for Blackwood Global Logistics. I'm aware of what he filed. He has documentation he claims supports that characterization. He has documentation he created," she said. "The engagement memo he filed 3 weeks before I was assigned lists my name in a context that suggests I was selected for a specific purpose. It does not document my consent to that purpose because my consent was never sought. He chose me the way you choose a tool, because I was the right shape for the job he needed done. He did not ask me because asking me would have produced the answer he didn't want. He claims you approached him after the initial findings to discuss structuring the report. He said that to me on a phone call I recorded," she said. "In that call, he does not describe what I allegedly proposed. He does not reference a meeting or a date or specific language I allegedly used. He tells me to think very carefully about what I'm doing, which is not the response of a managing partner who has declined an unethical proposal from a subordinate. It is the response of a man who has just discovered that the person he set up has found the evidence." She paused. "If I had approached him to bury the findings, he would have documentation of that conversation. He doesn't have it because it didn't happen." Cor looked at her for a long moment. "The recording has been reviewed by our technical team," he said. "The contents are consistent with your characterization." Frances beside her made no visible movement, but something in her stillness shifted fractionally. The stillness of someone absorbing a result they had worked toward. "What happens to Gerald Marsh?" Madeline said. Cor looked at her with the careful neutrality of a federal agent discussing an ongoing matter. "That's not something I can speak to. I'm not asking for details," she said. "I'm asking whether the voluntary disclosure he filed, which was designed to transfer criminal liability from himself to me, is going to be treated as credible given the documentary evidence that contradicts it." A pause. "The Northern District assesses all disclosures against available evidence." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at his folder, then at her. "The audit you filed is the most complete financial reconstruction of a criminal organization's operations that this task force has received in an unsolicited voluntary disclosure. Our forensic accountants have been working through it since Friday. They have found no material inaccuracies." She held his gaze. "I don't file material inaccuracies," she said. Cor nodded. "Once. Slowly." "We're aware of that, Ms. Hayes. We've been aware of that since we ran your background in month 2 of the investigation." He closed the folder. "That's why when Marsh named you as a participant, it didn't fit the profile. It took us 11 days to get to a point where we could test his account against yours, but the profile was always the problem." She was quiet for a moment. You were already looking at him, she said. We were already looking at the structure that connected him to the Blackwood network, Kaur said. Your audit named it with a precision our team had been working toward for 6 months. The room was quiet. The recycled air moved through its vents with its low institutional sound. Francis said, What is the task force's current position on my client's exposure? Kaur looked at Francis and then at Madeline. Your client is not a target of this investigation. She has not been a target since the audit was filed. She is a witness, and potentially a material witness, in the cases that will proceed from the investigation's findings. He paused. The case against Gerald Marsh will be filed within 30 days. Fraud, bribery, criminal conspiracy. The documentation is sufficient. Madeline thought about Gerald Marsh's hands in his pockets, his eyes that wouldn't quite land, the particular self-protective energy of a man who had made a decision about someone and was simply executing it. And Blackwood Global, she said. Kaur picked up his pen and set it down again. The restructuring you documented is a significant complicating factor in how the Northern District approaches the historical enterprise. The negotiation of that outcome involves parties and processes above my level to discuss in this room. He looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is that the filing of a complete and accurate independent audit by the CFO of record prior to indictment is a factor that matters to the outcome. It was the most she was going to get, and she knew it. She stood. Francis stood. At the door she turned. Agent Kaur, one question. He waited. The task force has been active for 8 months, she said. How long were you aware of Gerald Marsh's connection to the network before he filed his voluntary disclosure? A pause. 4 months. She nodded. He thought he was getting ahead of it. Most people do, Kaur said. It rarely helps as much as they believe it will. She walked out. Gerald Marsh was arrested on a Thursday morning 6 weeks later at 7:22 a.m. outside the Michigan Avenue office building that housed Delaney, Marsh, and Cole's Chicago headquarters. 2 federal agents met him at the entrance. He was taken without incident, which was how the Northern District's press release described it, in the particular bureaucratic language that covered the full range of human reactions to the end of a constructed life. Madeline read the press release on her phone in the car on the way to Blackwood Global's headquarters. She read it once. Then she put her phone in her bag. She thought about how she had once believed, in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet been tested at the right temperature, that Gerald Marsh was a difficult man she worked for who occasionally made her feel small and frequently took credit for other people's thinking. She had not known how much smaller his understanding of her was than that. She had not known that he looked at her and saw a surface, a credential, a signature, a professional reputation that could be borrowed and used and discarded. She had learned over the past 3 months that being underestimated by the wrong person was among the most dangerous things that could happen to you. She had also learned that it could be the thing that saved you if you were paying attention. She got out of the car. The Northern District filed a negotiated resolution with Blackwood Global 38 days after Gerald Marsh's arrest. It was not immunity. It was not clean. It involved significant financial penalties, mandatory compliance monitoring for 5 years, and the formal dissolution of every remaining entity in the historical criminal network, documented against Madeline's audit findings with a specificity that the Northern District's press release described as unprecedented in the district's handling of RICO-adjacent corporate restructuring cases. Nathaniel spent 2 days in the U.S. Attorney's office the week before the filing. She did not ask him what was said there. He did not volunteer it. What she knew was what the documents showed. The negotiated resolution named him as the responsible executive of the historical enterprise, while simultaneously acknowledging the documented restructuring and the CFO's independent audit as material factors in the disposition of the case. He was not indicted. He was not exonerated. He was something in between, which was the honest territory, and she had learned enough about honesty over the past months to recognize it when it showed up in an imperfect shape. She was in her office now on the 14th floor, with her name on the door and her audit findings framed above the credenza not as decoration, but as the specific reminder she had decided she needed every morning about what she was capable of. When he knocked and came in without waiting. It was late. Most of the floor had gone home. The cleaning crew had come and gone, and the building had the specific quality of late evening quiet that she had come to know over 3 months of working in it, past the point when everyone else left. He sat in the chair across from her desk. His suit jacket was off. He looked, for the first time in her knowledge of him, tired in a way he wasn't concealing. "It's done," he said. "I know. I read the filing." "Of course you did." Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile. "How does it look from where you're sitting?" "Like a company that got away with less than it deserved and more than most would," she said. "Which is probably accurate." He nodded. "The compliance monitor starts in 90 days, she said. "I've already been in contact with the firm the district has appointed. I know one of their senior partners. The process will be manageable if we stay ahead of it." "You've already been in contact." It seemed like the logical next step. He looked at her across the desk with the same full attention he had given her in the bar on her birthday, which felt like a different lifetime, and also, in the way of certain significant things, like it had happened approximately yesterday. She understood now what she had not understood then. The attention was not unusual for him in the sense of being rare. It was unusual in the sense that he gave it to almost no one. She had simply been, from the first moment, someone he found worth looking at carefully. "Madeline," he said. "I know," she said. Not sharp, just honest. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "The part that comes next, the part where the thing that held everything together, the work, the crisis, the reason to be in the same room every day, the part where that's over." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that. She had worked beside him for 3 months, and she knew precisely how much it cost him to say something that wasn't protected by professional language or the architecture of a negotiation. "I don't know either," she said. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me that wasn't about a financial document. I'm better with financial documents." "I know." A pause. "You're not bad at the other thing." She looked at him across the desk in the quiet of the building at 9 o'clock at night, and she thought about the woman who had walked across a bar on her birthday because she refused to give someone the satisfaction of her retreat. She thought about what that woman had been trying to prove, and whether the thing she had been trying to prove had anything to do with the person sitting across from her now, and she decided the answer was no. That what she had built over the past 3 months had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. It had been built because the work required it, and because she was the person the work required. That was the thing she had not known about herself before this. She had known she was good. She had not known what she was capable of when the stakes were the kind that couldn't be managed with competence alone. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'm the CFO of this company. I have a compliance monitor starting in 90 days and a financial restructuring to maintain and the better part of a year's work before this place is running the way I want it to run." She paused. "What happens between us or doesn't happen is a separate question from that. I need you to understand that." "I understand that." "I mean, I need you to actually understand it, not agree with it because I said it." He looked at her steadily. "I built a criminal empire, and then I spent 11 years trying to figure out how to get out of it without destroying everything. I don't make agreements. I don't mean, Madeline. It's inefficient." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me that wasn't about a financial document." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, the thing that lived in the territory adjacent to one. "Go home," she said. "It's late. We have a compliance meeting at 8 tomorrow." He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped, which was what she had done, in this same building, 3 months ago on a night that had changed the shape of everything after it. "For what it's worth," he said without turning. "What I said at the gala, the CFO announcement, that wasn't only strategic." She looked at her desk, at the framed audit findings above the credenza, at the Chicago skyline through the window that she had watched go dark and go light again so many times over the past months that it had stopped looking like a view and started looking like a clock. "I know," she said. "Good night, Nathaniel." He left. She sat alone at her desk for a while, not thinking about anything that required resolution. Just sitting in the quiet of a building that 3 months ago had felt like foreign territory and now felt not like hers exactly, but like a place where she had earned the right to occupy space without apologizing for it. She thought about Sadie Wren, who had called once, 5 weeks ago, with the specific energy of someone trying to position themselves adjacent to a story that had become interesting. Madeline had let the call go to voicemail. She had not returned it and did not intend to. She thought about Priya, who had texted twice, genuine texts, she believed, from someone who understood that something had changed permanently and was not sure what to do with that. She would call Priya, not tonight, but she would, because Priya's failures had been the failures of someone who was not paying attention, which was different from deliberate harm. And Madeline had learned to make distinctions about damage now that she had seen the real variety. She thought about her 26th birthday and the woman who had walked across a bar to kiss a stranger because she was angry at the shape of a dare and refused to give anyone the satisfaction of her retreat. She would not have chosen the chain of events that had followed. She would not have chosen the fear or the exhaustion or the nights in hotel rooms running numbers until her vision blurred. She would not have chosen the moment on a Tuesday sidewalk when she understood that a man she had worked for 8 years had sold her like an asset in a portfolio restructure. But she had been tested at the right temperature, and she had not broken. And the woman sitting at the desk now, with her name on the door and her audit on the wall and 90 days until the compliance monitor arrived, and everything after that still to be determined, that woman was not the same one who had calculated exits at parties and worn her professional excellence like a shield against a world she was never quite sure would let her in. She knew what she was worth now, not because someone had told her, because she had done the accounting herself, under conditions that did not allow for error, and the numbers had come back correct. She turned off her desk lamp. The office went dark except for the city light coming through the window. Chicago at night, that particular illumination that was neither warm nor cold but simply present, the permanent indifferent light of a city that did not require your approval to keep running. She stood at the window for a moment and she looked at it, and she was not small in it, and she was not hidden in it, and she was not calculating her exit. Then she picked up her bag, and she put on her coat, and she walked out of the office and down the hallway and into the elevator, and she rode down through the silent building and out through the lobby and into the night. And the city received her the way it received everyone, without ceremony, without welcome, without apology. And she walked into it with her shoulders back and her hands steady and the absolute, unornamented certainty of someone who had found the floor of themselves and discovered it was solid. She did not look back. There was nothing back there she needed.